Chapter 15. Joan finished placing the last of the supply shelves and stepped back to survey their work. It had taken half an hour and a crapload of WD-40s on the casters to silently inch them into place. She wiped her sweaty palms on her jeans and took a shaky breath in. She jumped, startled, as Veronica crept up behind her and touched her shoulder. "Don't do that," she hissed. "Are you sure these are all in the right spots?" Veronica whispered. "Yeah, it's pretty basic physics, actually. Do you remember the order to push them over in?" Veronica nodded, but her face was anything but sure. I think so. "Let's just run through them again," Joan suggested. "Thanks." "Sure. So I'll start with that one." She pointed. "The noise from it will draw her out, right? Then which one will you push?" Veronica hesitated, then leveled a finger toward another shelf. "That one, right? Toward the door." Veronica nodded. "Right. And then I push..." Veronica pointed again. "That one. And then I do that one over there, and then you do that one, and then I push that one. Nope, that's the last one." "Right. This one here." Veronica poked a carton of straws on the shelf directly in front of them. "And then that one is last." "Yeah. One more time." Veronica ran through it again, correctly this time. Satisfied, Joan got into position at her first shelf, waiting for Veronica to do the same. Then she pulled out her phone and texted Sadie. "We're ready. Make the call." The plan would work best if Brandon knew they were rescuing him, so Sadie had gone upstairs to place a call from her cell to the bar. She would instruct Allison not to answer, and after a few rings, it would go to the answering machine in the office. She would leave a message full of coded hints for Brandon to hear, letting him know something was up. The phone rang. Joan strained her ears to hear what was happening in the office, but she could only hear the brrrring of a landline phone. She lifted a hand, holding up one finger. It rang again, and she unfolded a second finger. Third ring. Third finger. She pointed at the door. The machine always clicked on after 3 rings. The ringing stopped, but the machine didn't click on. Joan frowned into the silence. She sidled toward the office door. She stopped just outside the doorway and peered in. Wendy was seated at the desk, looking at her tablet again, strolling down a page, frowning in concentration. There was an empty, slightly discolored space in the corner of the desktop where the old beat-up black answering machine used to sit. Where was it? Joan desperately searched the office, eyes roving everywhere, to no avail. Suddenly she spotted it, in the worst possible location, crammed into the wastebasket, its spiraled cord wrapped around its slim rectangular body. And then, into the hush, her cell phone went, chirp! Hi, Chalupa. Joan ducked away from the door, just as Wendy's head was snapping up. She sprinted toward the safety of the shelves, calling out in the loudest, quiet voice she could muster, "Start it! Push over the first shelf!" She skidded to a halt behind the shelter of a rack of beer bottles, just as the first shelving unit came crashing down, and pulled her phone out to see what urgent missive had so derailed their plan. Sadie. "No more machine. The call forwarded to Jessica's cell." Great. Everything derailed because she forgot to silence her phone, and Sadie felt the need to communicate the obvious. She glanced up and saw Wendy silhouetted in the doorway, motionless, calmly examining the carnage of shelf number 1, watching the room for motion. Joan looked around herself and found that she had instinctively run to the correct spot. She was in position to push down the second shelf. But Wendy wasn't where she was supposed to be. They had planned on her heading behind the first rack to see what had happened. Then they would push them down in order to trap her within. There was no point in pushing down the second shelf, unless maybe that would draw her out. But it couldn't be the order they planned, because then Wendy wouldn't have the right path into the middle of the circle. Joan studied the arrangement, sorting the shelves and the angles in her mind. The one that Veronica would have done third would be perfect. Just skip the second one, draw Wendy over there, and then proceed as planned. She locked eyes with Veronica, who was staring at her with bleak desperation on her face. She held up 3 fingers and made a pushing gesture. Veronica furrowed her brow, her eyes darting back and forth, looking for a clue to what the gesture meant. Joan pointed to the shelf in question and mimed pushing it again. Veronica's face brightened, and she tiptoed to the correct spot, glancing up at Joan again for confirmation. Joan nodded emphatically. Veronica pulled the shelf, and it thundered to the floor, smashing glasses and battering the concrete floor with its metal supports. Joan spun around to gauge Wendy's reaction. The witch remained still, moving only her head to peer in this new direction. Her eyes narrowed. Joan and Veronica remained frozen in place, watching Wendy. Slowly, Wendy took a step into the storeroom. She stopped, moving her head this way and that, gazing into the dim room. She turned around, and Joan saw her look toward the doorway, spotting the light switch. Thank goodness they'd thought of that. Wendy flipped the switch, but Veronica had removed the bulbs before they'd started rearranging everything. Wendy growled in frustration. She turned back to the shelves again, a frown marring her beautiful face. Good. People who were angry made mistakes. Joan ignored the little voice in her head that pointed out that she was also angry. That was different. She had right on her side. She turned back to Veronica and pointed to each of the racks in turn, indicating to return to the original order. Veronica gave her a thumbs up and moved silently to the next position. Wendy glided forward into the midst of the shelves, and Joan braced herself, waiting until she was in the right spot. Then she gave a mighty shove, and the shelf crashed down. This one was filled with napkins, so it was less dramatic and a little disappointing. She shrugged and moved toward the next position. Joan froze as Wendy began to mutter to herself. Her eyes widened, staring at Wendy's hands, which had just begun to glow.